All right. So, hello, everyone. My name is Keith Kellerstone. I'm an applied business and organizational anthropologist. And today I have with me Jay Hasbrouck, who has his PhD in social anthropology from the University of Southern California. He's the author of several articles on anthropology and business, including a book on anthropology and business called Ethnographic Thinking from Method to Mindset. And yes, it's available on Amazon. In the past, he's been employed by Intel and IDEO and is currently employed at Facebook in Seattle, Washington. Well, it's a great meeting and talking to you today. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you're doing now at Facebook?
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Keith. Happy to be here, and I appreciate you asking me to join you for a conversation.
Great.
I've recently been at Facebook. It's been about just over a year now. And what I do here is kind of a mix. I have a role that's called an ecosystem pathfinding role. So ecosystem meaning that I'm looking across products, and pathfinding looking out toward the future, say, between the present and 5 years, trying to get a sense of what the next is for social media in the cultural context. Mm-hmm. So, for example, right now I'm exploring the topic, and I have been exploring for a while, the topic of storytelling and the role of storytelling on social media, to give you an idea of how it works within the company.
Yeah. So in doing your work, is there some insights that you can share with us that may be helpful to others?
Sure. Yeah. I think not too long ago, a number of people have been. There were a lot of posts circulating around social media in general, and LinkedIn and elsewhere about what does that transition look like between being an academic or coming from a sort of a more sort of disciplinary approach to an applied approach. And I have a blog post about it as well, but I think there are a few changes that are really pretty, that stand out a lot, and they're I think worth talking about in contexts like this. One of them is, at least personally, I've noticed, and I know a lot of people that I've talked to have noticed, that your training as an anthropologist is very much individualistic, right? It's like you're like this, you're going to go out there and explore this new terrain, and come back with these insights, and bring them back and have this groundbreaking impact. And while you do plenty of exploring in applied settings, often your work is collaborative, much more collaborative than it would be in an academic setting. So I think one of the things that's really critical is, when people are moving into an applied setting, is to really lean into that collaboration. And it's not like anthropologists don't collaborate, right? When you're in the field, you have to collaborate, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do field work, right?
Yeah.
So it's a matter of just taking those skills and transferring them back in, and thinking about, where are there other opportunities to collaborate, even before you get to the field, in the field, and when you come back, or in any of the contexts. I think it's a really valuable skill, and you have to be able to do that, I think, to survive in the applied setting.
Yeah.
I think, there are other things too, like, in addition to taking the way in which you're trained to do field work and collaborate with participants in the field, there are other ways to think about how you can take those skills and transfer them into a work setting. And I think that a lot of us as anthropologists are trained to be really good facilitators, or to navigate unfamiliar terrain. There are a whole set of things that you need to be able to do effectively to be able to collect data to get to your insights. Using those inside of a company as part of your work is incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot you can get accomplished with that, versus just sort of treating it like a job. And that is just where you are during the day, and then you're really supposed to do it out in the field. Well, I think it's probably much more. There's a lot more symbiosis there than people assume.
Right. And the whole concept of teamwork is so important, I think, in any company. And, meeting facilitation is important at any company. And I've had a long career, not so much doing anthropology in business so much as just working in the corporate settings. And all of those skills, kind of get ingrained into you, even if you're not in anthropology. But when you have it with anthropology, you're going to add so much more, and so much of a richer experience and a richer sort of insight into the company behavior and their products and marketing and all of these things that you could uh, really imagine that you could add to the company. So what do you think are some of the top skills that anthropologists can bring to any company?
Well, I think I'll just back up and respond to what you said real quick as well, because I think there's one more thing to add there, and that is that I've been kind of pushing this hashtag for a while, and that is the ethnography of everything.
Yes.
And I really do think that once you're trained to think as an ethnographer, you should really be able to take that skill and aim it almost anywhere, and aiming it
Yep.
internally, to your team, your company. That, and actually this kind of transitions to what you were asking too. Like, that is one of the things that's really valuable that ethnographers and anthropologists bring to the workplaces. Not only are they looking at the customer, but they should have the ability to take that lens and aim it at the company and at the teams, and be able to integrate all those things. To think about, how is the product or the service positioned in the world?
Mm-hmm.
How is it that the internal culture is either working for or against innovation for a new product and service?
Sure.
It's super valuable. Not every role is designed that way, I think, within
Right.
companies, but it is a skill that I think sometimes gets overlooked, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like companies could get sort of more productive value out
Yes.
of ethnographers if they leaned into that a bit more.
Mhm.
And I think, I mean, beyond that, I think that there's some other things there's that sort of describes the ways in which ethnographers are taught to think holistically and systemically, and those kind of, they come hand in hand.
Mhm.
So that's maybe less obvious, or that maybe is more obvious than things like the ways that ethnographers occupy liminal spaces. So it's like you've got many instances where you're both the insider and the outsider, and that can happen in an applied setting as much as it can in any other setting. And being able to speak to that and talk about what that value is, that you're not completely native in any setting,
Right.
in some ways, is a really good way to say, hey, this is a person that'll help us keep from getting stuck in our own heads,
Right.
which is super valuable in a lot of companies, because it's very easy for people just to silo
Yes.
and narrow in on their task.
And I think that's part of company culture is you're doing a job, and you are kind of almost expected within the culture to stay focused on stay in your lane, basically, right? And kind of not look left or right, and just stay in your lane. And I think then companies wonder why. Well, how come we're having a problem with teamwork, and how come this group isn't talking to that group, and how come these people aren't collaborating better? Well, when you tell people to stay in your lane, it's kind of hard to do that, and
Yeah.
and to build those bridges. And I think one thing anthropologists and ethnographers can bring is, if anything, we can kind of jolt people out of their complacency a little bit, and jolt people from this narrow tunnel vision view of, I'm here to do my job. I'm only doing my job. I believe it was Walt Disney, I could be wrong here, that said there's three kinds of people in the world. There's life enhancers, lawnmowers, and well poisoners. And it's what I feel like sometimes we do in daily jobs is we're lawnmowers. We just mow our lawn, we just move ahead and do that sort of thing. But I think the anthropologist is going to come in there and say, forget about mowing your lawn. Why don't you look at the trees?
Yeah.
Why don't you look at the bushes? Why don't you look at the landscaping around the house, that sort of thing, and look at the whole picture, look at the big picture of everything you're doing. So, yeah.
Definitely. And look at ourselves as well, right?
Yeah.
Or let's look at our lawn,
Yeah.
But I think that I love that quote, by the way. But I think that I think one of the things that actually gets a company is a lot of things. One thing is, if you think about it internally, it gets at the differences between the structures that are set up and the kinds of behaviors that those prioritize, and then those informal interactions and behaviors that ethnographers are really trained to see.
Mhm.
So you can imagine, like the official rules say that this is the way we should be working, but
Right.
an ethnographer actually is pretty skilled at seeing, what are those workarounds that are happening? Where are people who are informally influencing having actually quite a bit of impact? So that's incredibly beneficial to draw attention to those things and get the most value from them. And then I think on the in the external sense, there's a large degree of risk reduction that goes on that comes from this set of skills. So if we have a better sense of how a product or a service might land within a culture, or
Mhm.
at least we have a good understanding of what the range of the ways in which it might land can be, that's a lot different than just sort of saying, oh, well, we think it's going to work, so, but,
It's a great
actually,
idea. I don't see why it
yeah.
wouldn't work. Well, did you take a look at the culture that you're trying to sell this product to, or implement this service in and see if they really like it?
Yeah.
I'll never forget, and I've said this before in other ones, when Walmart went into Germany, and they eventually had to pull out of Germany because their business model that they had was not working in the German culture. And I can remember when I went to Germany, I think it was in 2006, my cousin, who's a German national, I mean, they're Germans, she was just apoplectic about Walmart in general and was kind of glad they were leaving. And I remember her saying, keine Pause, which in German means no breaks. The employees never got any breaks throughout the day. And, in Germany, in the stores, if you go to Aldi, you can see this because Aldi is a German company. The clerks, the cashiers are sitting down. And at Walmart here in the United States, they're standing up all day. And this was just, unacceptable, in the German culture. And then eventually, people realized in Germany how employees were being treated, and they didn't shop there anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's very important in German culture is, the way employees are treated, and, what kind of, not so much benefits they have in the company, but what kind of status they have in the company and that sort of thing. So next thing you know, Walmart's pulling out of Germany because they're not selling. And, that's the thing is that company had this very narrow vision of, well, this is what works for us and this is what's always worked. And so we're going to do this over here and it should be no problem. Well, it was a problem and you failed.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how different European markets are.
Yeah.
From American markets. And a lot of American companies just assume, oh, well, it's the Western world. It'll land fine.
It's the same. Everybody's the same. You're right.
Yeah, and there are many stories like that where it just collapses on different companies. And part of that is maybe they did very little homework first. But another part of that is in many cases strategy is formed from gut instinct in a lot of companies. It's sort of like you got some people who are basically trained as planners for the most part.
Yeah.
And they form strategy based on projections rather than the kind of data that we collect as social scientists. So it makes a big difference, and I think that's huge value for any company. I think a lot of companies are starting to wake up to it as they fail. In new market.
Yeah, it's the same with Facebook. My cousins who are on Facebook from Germany, most of them, they don't like Facebook at all. They don't like putting all their personal stuff out there and pictures of their kids and all this. That's just very uncomfortable to them. And I think it was in 2006 when I went over there too. I was like, why aren't you on Facebook? Get on Facebook, use Facebook, and we can communicate all the time. They're like, no, we don't like Facebook. You should use WhatsApp. Like, what's WhatsApp? I've never heard of this before, whatever. Well, I'm on WhatsApp and Facebook. We're both on both platforms to talk to them. Of course, now WhatsApp has been purchased by Facebook, so it owns it there. But again, it's a thing about culture, right? Germans are not as I guess you could say gregarious as Americans. We have no problem telling everyone all of our business and everything that's going on. The Germans are not like that. They've been down that road. They've had that, people knowing their business, and they don't want that anymore.
Yeah. I did quite a bit of field work in Germany at one point. I think at Intel, and then again later when I had my own consultancy. And as you know, the division between private life and public life is really marked there.
Oh,
So
yes.
it's like it's you, and it shows in lots of ways, like you said, in terms of work schedules and opening and closing times and all that,
Mhm.
like,
Yep.
and you see that play out in so many different ways, particularly around product use, and especially a product that is, like the way it manifests itself is on a phone that it can go with you anywhere,
Yeah.
like it's a pretty big infringement on privacy if you allow it to be.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So, what do you think companies and their hiring managers and recruiters need to know to understand the value of the anthropological skill set when it comes to positions in business?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting because kind of based on what we've been talking about so far, right? There are
Yeah.
a lot of people in companies and also just nonprofits and other places that are beginning to understand the value of ethnographic thinking for, understanding customers, and even some getting that internal look as well.
Mhm.
Um, the degree to which that has sort of seeped into the recruiting process and understanding sort of how are we identifying those sort of markers of value coming from anthropology and ethnography, I'm unsure. So I think it maybe is getting there. We'll see. But one of the things that I would like to see are those recruiters understanding like that much of what we have to bring to the table is more than just sort of, here's what the customer thinks. It's also strategic thinking, and that the kind of insight that we have and should be informing strategy in addition to informing, feature sets, or, product styles, or, locations of availability of product. So I think that there's so much there that where we could be tapped as navigators
Mhm.
in terms of strategy in a way that brings cultural perspective into that process. The Walmart example is a perfect case, right?
Yeah.
So there is one where it's like, okay, when you're hiring, both for someone who can get into the field and has maybe demonstrated that they can and bring back relevant insights that inform product, but also understanding how that changes the way the company operates and relates to the world.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think that is probably the single most, if I could talk to all recruiters in the world and say, where could you get more value out of this group of people, I think that is primarily the
Yeah.
most important place.
So, what can we as anthropologists and ethnograph, ethnograph, ethnographers do? I was like, forgot how do I conjugate that word? How can do to help companies understand the value of the anthropological skill set?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do, and I wouldn't want to place like all the burden on us.
Right.
Of
Of course,
course, it's a conversation.
it is.
Um, but I do think that there are times when we need to make more effort to get into different kinds of conversations. It's very easy, I think, for us to only talk to each other or
Yep.
feel more comfortable talking to each other, and some of
Right.
that's just a shortcut, right? It's like the language is comfortable, the way of thinking about the world is similar,
Mhm.
but I think we have to stop talking to each other as
That's
much
right.
and start having those conversations. And in many cases, I have learned from experience that that does mean repeating yourself a lot,
A lot.
um, which
I
is
have found
something
that
you
to
just
be
have to.
true.
Yes, totally. I think you just have to become comfortable with it, right? It's
Yep.
like
Yep.
it's like Anthro 101 again, but
Again.
it has to happen. Yeah, so I think that for sure, just like opening up that conversation, each of us has to be a little bit of sort of an advocate, for the value of what it is that we do, in addition to just executing.
Mhm.
um, I would say the other thing is that I think that one of the things that a lot of cases, in our discipline has been, and a lot of value has been derived from reflexivity, looking back at the discipline and, where are we providing value? Where might we be getting in our own way? Certainly super valuable to be able to sort of be self-aware and deconstruct.
Yeah.
I do think that can go too far, and I think at some point it starts to undermine our credibility as professionals.
Mhm.
So, like at the end of the day, I think we probably should all be asking ourselves, so what is this discipline for? What are,
Right.
in my opinion. I mean, I've trained at, I'm a certain age and trained in a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think that we are inherently activists. I think that we're inherently scientists, and
Mhm.
that's what I think that we should be doing. So I think that actually goes much further in business settings than people coming in or people meeting you knowing that when you walk in the door you have an agenda.
Right.
So I've seen some of that, some of the
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
anthropology's been changing, and I'm like, yeah. So I think there's
Yeah.
a little bit of let's lean into our science a bit more that would help us establish or maintain credibility in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It's a balance between the science and the advocacy. And I think even in companies, if companies want to be innovative and change and grow and adapt their culture, if you're an anthropologist working in that area, in a sense, you want to advocate for the science. You see what
Right.
I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because you want to push that forward. Yeah, what about this? And what about that? And have you looked at this? And have you looked at that? But what about looking at it from this perspective? And in a sense, that can be viewed, I think, as being as being an activist or an advocate, because I think sometimes you're challenging the status quo
That's
and,
true.
and kind
Yeah.
of getting them out of that complacency, as we talked to again, and kind of causing a little trouble there, but not in a sense of where it gets, goes down the sort of political or that sort of road.
Yeah. I get where you're going. I mean, I think you're right. I think in that sense we should be advocates, and we should be advocates in terms of speaking for or trying to develop, responsible representations of our participants for sure.
Correct.
That's definitely part of our job.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, Kathy Kittner. She's also an anthropologist at Google now.
Yeah.
And she talks about us as a discipline being sometimes the burr in the saddle, which I love that metaphor, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I agree. We should definitely be asking the hard questions and challenging, productively challenging the status quo. So yeah, I'm on board with all that. It's just like, as you mentioned, it's sort of like politicizing. I think our advocacy is more about the discipline than it should be about, some ideology, basically, other than science.
Right. Exactly. It's not an ideological discipline. It's a scientific discipline.
Yeah, in my opinion, at least that's the way I see it. I mean,
Yeah.
The other thing that I think would be really useful for us to do, the thing is, I don't think most people are trained to do this in anthropology or ethnography, and that is start to think more creatively about our deliverables, and thinking about who are we talking to, and what are they going to respond to,
Right.
and really, we're very skilled at being adaptive, right? Because you need to be adaptive to do field work and many of the things that we do.
Mm-hmm.
But then sometimes when we get to the reporting stage, we get really constrained in our thinking. We start thinking about like the deliverable being very, very sort of tightly conceived.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a ton of room for us to start leaning in on visuals and frameworks, and like just getting more creative with the ways that we touch people with our work. Like to begin with, in many cases you can tell a story with what it is that we do, and begin with perhaps an emotion, and then move on to convincing with data, and then maybe I'm just throwing out a narrative thread here, convincing with data, and then maybe reinforcing with theory, so you're building the hooks, rather than taking people through like, okay, here's our methodology.
Yeah.
Here's our sample size. And by the time you get to slide 3, they're asleep.
Right.
So, I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that space.
Yeah, I think that's also sort of a teaching edge to that, where other people in business who don't understand anthropology or ethnography, you're kind of teaching them how to understand the way we understand it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that doing that only helps us more, because then we don't have to explain ourselves, 1,000 times over in different ways. Even when I worked at Toyota and I was there for 10 years, when we would do reports, the way we would do it our reports to a manager would be different than we would word it to a vice president, which would be different than we would reword it to someone else in another group. And sometimes people were kind of like, well, why don't we just give everybody the same report? Wouldn't that be more efficient? Well, it's because those people understand it in a different way.
Yep.
And also we kind of had to sort of adjust it to their personality a little bit too, of what their trigger words were, words that we don't want to put in there, like the word problem. We don't want to put in there that we're solving a problem. We are addressing an issue, it's something
Right.
a little bit more, because a problem, someone may just lose it on that. And it's that kind of wisdom that you have to have, and at the same time, I think sometimes in business, we want to give higher ups a lot of information so that they completely understand everything holistically. But usually they want you to simplify it. And I had one instance when I worked at Toyota where, I had a higher up tell me, you've got too much information on this report. I need more detail.
I love that.
Okay, that was interesting. So what kind of detail do you want? Okay, take all this stuff out and put this stuff in. And, after so many revisions of the report, sometimes we would come back to having something very similar to what we had before. But that's only because we had to go and talk to this person over and over again, and kind of what they call nemawashi in Toyota language is you kind of talk to them and you kind of explain to them what you're presenting to them before you present it to them, so that way when you present it to them, there's no problem.
There's a lot to be said for those conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can see that translating into a number of cases. And I mean, you could also think about, does a deliverable need to be sort of the package at the end with the bow on top?
Right.
Can it also be staged out, and could it also be delivered in a way that says, hey, I want to engage you guys with this, bring you into the process, and this is a work in process. So yeah. I would like you to be part of it. As you mentioned, it's sort of a great way to bring people into how we think, and not just sort of like, what are we getting, the product of our work.
Mm-hmm. I often think about sort of conversations about data. There's a big emphasis right now on quantitative data. Those what we would call quantitative data, like people analytics and people wanting data and big data and information. And that's great, but once you get it, what do you do with it, right? And how do you make the decisions based on that data? From an ethnographer standpoint or from an anthropologist standpoint, you've kind of got to talk about that data, right? Mm-hmm. And what it means before you make a decision on it. And to get to what it means, you've got to bring in a more holistic picture. Whether it's you add the qualitative data, you do ethnography, you bring in other things, observations, videos, whatever it is. Because just because you present a big, huge data report to a higher up doesn't mean that they know from that data what the decision is, what that decision should be. The data doesn't make the decision for them.
Yep.
I think, excuse me, sometimes they want data that will make the decision for them. They say, I want data that's actionable. Well, there's no such thing, right? Because you are the one who are making the action based on your information from the data. The data is, you're never going to get data that's a no-brainer. That's you're going to look at it in front of you and say, oh, then I know exactly what to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're never going to get to a situation where when you make a decision and someone questions you on it, say, well, the data told me this is what I should do. This is not how it works. This is not how it works. And that's never going to happen. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of room for anthropologists and ethnographers to really come into that space and to sort of help everyone understand, data, you've got data, but that's only one piece of this bigger picture, right? So I really, really hope that, more companies understand anthropology and ethnography, to bring them in and say, gosh, bring us in to help make this decision,
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to add to what you're saying, and that is that what you're getting at in many ways is the interpretive value that we bring to the setting, right? So it's not like, and I always cringe when I hear people say, oh, I worked with an anthropologist on this, and they were able to infiltrate this this group of people, and tell us all their secrets. And it's like, well, we're not spies.
Right.
And number one, and number two, we're not just there to bring back, literally what's happening in the field. We're there to interpret what's going on and
Right.
provide. And that interpretive lens is the value. That's the core of the value that we offer.
Mhm.
So it isn't a one-to-one. I think it's really important for us. You can say that, but I think for someone to let that really soak in, they have to kind of understand what is our synthesis process, what is our analysis process. So I think it's also very useful to say in a conversation, perhaps like in a working meeting, like you mentioned, Keith, okay, we've got these insights. Let me tell you how we got here. We got here because we identified this set of themes, and those set of themes came from these observations, and these observations came from this field interaction, or so work your way backwards so they can get like, oh, okay, I see on aggregate, you're starting to see patterns, and just what, it isn't really that hard to do, but it looks like a black box to a lot of people, I think, without a bit of a walkthrough.
Yeah. Interesting times, huh?
Yeah, definitely.
I think we've all been in those meetings, maybe not officially as an anthropologist or ethnographer, but I've been in those meetings too, where there's a lot of conversation and debate about what the meaning of the data is and what decisions should be made and who's going to make the decision. And, that's your interpretation and that's your opinion and that sort of thing. So yeah, hopefully that, like I said, companies can understand, like you're talking about the synthesis. How did we get there? How did we come to these conclusions? How did we come to these insights and these ideas? And they understand our process, and then they can decide, intelligently whether to take it or leave it.
Yeah.
If they leave it,
always,
then that's your choice. Let me know how that goes. Kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and then the other thing, especially if it's cultural or behavioral, we can also point to, in addition to our process, we can say, well, we also can base this on knowledge we know about whatever rites of passage or gift exchange or whatever it is that make, we know that humans in these settings tend to behave these ways, so that helps build the case. But as you mentioned, it's sort of like at the end of the day, whoever owns the business typically makes the final call. So
that's right. And just like we talked before I started recording about, the application process and the recruiting process. I mean, you want to talk about going through a rite of passage, and trying to understand ambiguity, and that sort of thing. That would be, as I've often said, that's the whole sort of recruiting and hiring process, and interview process, and that sort of thing. That is such a great anthropological study and something that could be so valuable to companies. They're always looking for good people. Well, what is your definition of what a good people is, right?
Yeah.
And what do you mean by that? So
yeah, and imagine there's so much, there's a lot there, but there's also a lot of hidden data, right?
That's right.
There's so much that's not said, and
that's right.
It's just filled with. It would be very interesting to take that on for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions I had for you today. Is there anything else you want to add or, tell the people who will be viewing this video?
No. Thank you for having me. I think that the more we can talk about the ways in which anthropology and ethnography, can be used in applied settings, the happier I am, because I think it's an important place. We're an important contribution, and I'm continually working toward that end.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. I will probably show this this coming Sunday night. It's usually when I show my videos. And I'm going to be doing these like once a month now.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, I was doing them almost every week. And I think right now, once a month is probably going to be a little bit better for everyone.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is. But I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Jay.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for asking me. And I'll look forward to seeing it online.
Great.